welcome everybody to yet another one of our talks here at Yale Center Beijing. Thank you for joining us. For those of you guys that are new here, my name is Devin Lau, and I am the Assistant Director for Yale Center Beijing. By a quick way of introduction, Yale Center Beijing was established in 2014 as Yale's only university-wide center, where we try to bring the latest and most interesting developments across academia and across different fields to our audiences here in China as well as around the world. And we've been very lucky since the pandemic to have many different professors join us from Yale, but also just from all over the world, which we also have today. It's always fun to try to connect people from multiple time zones into one talk. And so, normally we have everything from music to biology to economics to art history. So today we get a little bit of a mix, I guess, of literature and Germanic studies and, I guess art history also falls into this, and a little bit of everything today with a talk on Kafka's drawings. And so I'll introduce our two speakers, our one speaker and one host for the talk, which we are also very lucky to have. And then before I do that, I will say that if people are willing and able to turn on your video cameras so that we can see you, that would be most helpful, as it's always good to be able to feel like we're still in the same room a little bit by looking at different faces instead of just a wall of blank screens. So if people are able to please turn on your video cameras, that would be most helpful. And then while you're doing that, I will be able to introduce our speakers today. So Andrea Kilker is Professor of Literature and Cultural Studies at ETH Zurich, as well as President of the Board of the Thomas Mann Archives at ETH Zurich. He's also on the Board of Directors for the Center for the History of Knowledge at ETH, as well as the University of Zurich. He's held visiting professorships at Princeton, Stanford, UC Davis, and Tel Aviv University. And his main areas of interest include literary and cultural studies, history of knowledge, Jewish literary and cultural history. He's worked on a various number of authors, of course, today on Franz Kafka, as well as Max Frisch, Gershom Scholem, as well as a host of other people. Today, he will be joined by Paul North, who is Professor and Director of Undergraduate Studies of Germanic Languages and Literatures at Yale. He's a graduate of Northwestern, who writes and teaches on literature and other media, continental philosophy, and literary and critical theory. He is most interested in the afterlives of Kantian critical thought, deconstruction, literary theory, and poetry and poetics in a variety of languages and traditions. He's himself written on Kafka, as well as a host of very interestingly titled books, including The Problem of Distraction and Bizarre Privileged Items in the Universe. And so we're very lucky to have them both join us today. The format will be a conversation between the two of them, and then we will open it up to questions at the very end, which you can enter in the chat box while the conversation is going on, and I will do my best to select the relevant ones and moderate when the time comes. And so with that, one more reminder that if you would be so kind as to turn on your webcams so that we can see some of the people that we'll be talking with, that would be most helpful. And then I will turn everything over to Paul.
Thank you, Devin. Thanks to you for organizing this and to the Beijing program for hosting it. It's very rare to find something new in the Kafka zone. It's very rare to find something unknown for a writer for whom a lot is known. We have had his writings pretty much since he died, edited by his friend Max Brot, and about whom very little is known because it's very hard to understand what exactly he was doing in his short stories, in his life, in his letters. He seems to be developing a program, even a philosophical program, to answer certain questions. But those questions are hard to figure out. As anyone who's read Kafka's stories knows, they are more like legends than literature, more like paradoxes than arguments. So there's a lot that's unknown about Kafka, even though we have a lot of materials. But this is one of the first and only discoveries of materials that we really didn't know, discovered by a lot of people over the years, but really put together by Andrea Kilker, who I'm very happy to talk to today. I want to show the book, which is a beautiful book, just a gorgeous object put out by Yale University Press. We're going to talk about some of the materials, how they came to light, and what to do with them with a writer who's so globally known and so deeply unknown. What do you do with new material? So I want to turn to Andreas and ask you just to start, where were these drawings and how did you find them?
First of all, hello to everybody. I'm really glad to be here. And yeah, thanks also, Paul, for hosting these the questions. And yeah, the question is, the first question is, of course, it's a riddle, because for decades, we even didn't know about these drawings. Nobody knew about them except maybe two persons. One person was, until he died, Max Brod. He died in 1968, so quite some time ago. So he was the one who collected these drawings, and he was the one who published a few of a small selection of these drawings by Kafka during his lifetime, during Brod's lifetime, not during Kafka's lifetime. Only after Kafka's death, he started to publish a few of them. Something like a good dozen of these drawings. But the large part of these drawings has never been shown. And after his death, after Max Brod died in 1968, so the entire Kafka estate went to Brod's secretary, Ilse Esterhofe. So she was actually the second person to really know about these drawings. But she, even more than Max Brod, kept it away, locked these drawings away in a bank vault. In the end, in the last decades, these drawings has been kept. Maybe it sounds even funny, in a bank vault in Zurich, close to the place where I'm living. Actually, when I came to Zurich, I even didn't know that all this material is there in a bank. It sounds a little bit like a James Bond film, that you have always this small sequence in Zurich because they are numbered bank vaults, anonymous. Nobody knows what's in. Nobody knows to whom belongs the stuff. And in such a bank vault, these drawings have been kept until the death of Ilse Esterhofe. And after her death, which was in 2007, in Israel, a trial started about the question to whom belong now the estate of Kafka and Max Brod. And the Jewish National Library in Israel claimed that this is not belonging to the heirs of Ilse Esterhofe, meaning the secretary of Max Brod, but much more to themselves, to the National Library. I want to make it really short as possible, but they won the trial. The National Library won the trial. The Hofe family lost the trial, which means that in 2019, all these drawings have been transferred to Jerusalem, from Zurich to Jerusalem. And since I was following this trial very closely, because it was a very fascinating trial that went to all the courts in Israel, up to the Supreme Court, I knew exactly what was in these bank vaults in Zurich, because there was an inventory. I have been talking to people, interviewing people, so I knew what was in there. And to me, it was absolutely clear that there is one diamond in these bank vaults, and these are the drawings. People have been speculating what is in these bank vaults in Zurich, and in Israeli journals you could read unknown stories, novels by Kafka are in Zurich, and it was all completely exaggerated, wrong, because he knew everything except the drawings. So that's how I came to these drawings. And in the moment they have been transferred to Jerusalem, to the National Library of Israel, I took the plane, went there, and the project was there.
That's a great opening and a kind of bizarre itinerary for you and for the drawings. I want to get to maybe showing a drawing or two, but before then, would you talk a little bit about the absurdity of these places? Kafka was a human being who lived in Prague and spent most of his life in Prague. In fact, most of his life within about a 14-block area of Prague, except for a few trips. His work, these files and archives have a movement across a kind of diaspora and end up in a kind of Jewish national home, something that Kafka was himself a little vexed about. That is the idea of a political Zionism. It bothered him. So what do you think about where they ended up? What do you think about, what would Kafka have said? Maybe that's not the most interesting question, but tell a little bit more about the afterlife of these drawings.
You are absolutely right that there are many ironic turns in the entire history of Kafka's estate, not only that one. Already from his death in 1924, with the testament asking Max Brod to burn everything, which was ironical in my view. It was an ironical testament because he knew that Max Brod would never burn a single piece of paper on which he had written or drawn. Until, yeah, the fact that Max Brod in 1939, he could save the entire estate by Kafka from the Nazis who entered Prague, and he was taking, let's say, the last opportunity to get out of occupied Prague and to get to Israel, to Palestine at the time, Mandat Palestine. And I mean, so it was not a decision by Kafka, by far not a decision by Kafka what happened. So he gave it in the hand of Max Brod. So the irony that you are speaking of very well is, of course, also what did Max Brod with all that stuff. So Kafka knew he gives everything in the hand of his friend, and he knew that he would take care, but he didn't know in what way he took care. He will take care. So Brod took care in a very peculiar way. On the one hand, he saved everything several times, and also the fact that he transferred the Kafka writings from the place he lived in Tel Aviv from 1930 on to Zurich this was in 1956. It was to take responsibility, because this was the time of the so-called Suez crisis, and in Israel it was a big fear that the state will be overruled by Arab countries, and so Max Brod in that time he brought everything to Switzerland, a safe place, and only in 2019 the journey goes back to Jerusalem under completely different political contexts, and so you see all these ironical turns that are out of Kafka's hands completely. So he never, I'm sure he never would have dreamed that part of his writings, especially his drawings, would now be situated in the capital of, if you want to call it like this, of Zionism, Jerusalem, actually next to the Knesset.
Yeah, there's a number of ironies that these drawings should be sitting in Israel, representing a kind of memory of Europe for a totally different population. Of course, a lot of researchers can look at them too. What are they about? Do you want to show us some examples and we can get a sense of what Kafka was doing?
Yeah, sure. Let's have a look at some of these drawings. Let me ask you. So you see the presentation? So you see the drawings. Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it's best to start with a few examples to get an impression of these drawings. And I would like to start with 2-3 examples that haven't been known so far. And for example, this one is completely unknown until the book came out. So these drawings, they are mostly, as you see already here, about human beings. There are bodies of human beings, much less portraits. You see faces, you see some kind of faces. We can talk about the faces, but you see much more the entire bodies. And these bodies, they are in a very peculiar way, you could call them grotesque or carnivalesque or even caricaturesque. So these are not in any way realistic depictions of the human beings like, let's say, the Renaissance artists, or until the 19th century also arts students would try to depict the body in its shape and in all the proportions. It's completely out of proportions what Kafka is doing. It's also most certainly out of any kind of a school. He took some lessons. We can talk about that a little bit later. He took drawing lessons, and he was very much interested in art. He was even studying art history for a semester, his second semester, and he was actually indeed studying next to literature also art history. So he was also to somehow in a professional way dealing with art, but the way he was drawing, and the most of his drawings are actually from these early times, they are very far away from any kind of school, and they are at the same time very much away from any kind of, let's say, reality, even though there is, of course, a transformation of something real. If you, for example, look here, the title of these drawings, and this is a rare case because mostly Kafka didn't give titles to his drawings, but here you can see a title. It's in German, Übermut des Reichtums, on the right upper side. And in English, this would be something like exuberance of wealth. Is that right, Paul?
Sure.
Something in that direction. I think Übermut is not easy to translate because in German, this is a very positive expression. It means something like playfulness to an excess, even to the excess, and to an excess that it could even, when kids get übermütig, exuberant, so they can easily start to cry because they do something extreme. I mean, we see the richness depicted because you see these two ladies, or a lady and the man that's not 100% clear, sitting on the table, and they are served a huge bird by one servant, and the other one is bringing probably champagne in these slim high glasses. The bird could be a peacock, or also more a bird of fantasy or something like that. And you see a candelabrum, but it's only existing out of the candles. So the candelabrum is not really there. It's somehow there. And then you have an orchestra playing music on something like a huge balcony. And so, yeah, you see some kind of Übermut, but I would say here is, you see not only the exuberance of wealth, or of, yeah, you see also the exuberance of the art of drawing. It's a wealth of drawing. It's very playful. It's very, yeah. So that's something I would see in that drawing. Or what do you think, Paul?
I don't know what to think. This is a great description. one connotation that Übermut has that exuberance doesn't have in English is that it's a little too much, and it might be, as we say in English, something that goeth before the fall, as though it were just at the limit, and after this, things can only get worse. It's a decadence, you could say, a moment before the end of this kind of celebratory image. Given that this is an expression of exuberance, and this is a quite early image, is that right? Do we have a sense of when it's from?
There is no date, but it's very clear that this is from the time of Kafka's, when he was a student in Prague. And this is from around 1901 to 1906-7, that time around. So it's not, there's no clear date, but it's clear that most of these drawings are from that time. We can discuss about that. He didn't stop drawing when he moved more to the writing, but it's clear that his experiments with drawing were mainly in the time of his studies in the early time. So it's very clear that from there.
To give a very short timeline, Kafka was born in 1883 in Prague, and around the turn of the century was at university and studying ultimately to be a lawyer. He got several jobs in law and in the insurance industry, and then worked for the Bohemian version of the American OSHA, Occupational Health and Safety Inspectors, which protected workers, mostly industrial workers, from accidents that could happen on the job. And he was the attorney there, and he did that job until 1917, when he retired early because of health reasons. In the meantime, his writing went through a series of transformations. He claimed that he became himself, or we know the Kafka that we know was born in 1912 with one story called The Judgment, this Urteil. And most of the writing that we read from Kafka is between 1912 and 1922, 23, when he wound things down because he was really too sick to continue. What is the trajectory of development of these drawings? Do they change from this early moment when he was in school or was beginning to practice law? How does it look later on? Do you have a sense that there's something you can say about their transformations?
Yeah, that's a hard question, because as I said, only very few of these drawings are dated. So there are no dates written on it. So it's hard to say from when exactly these drawings are. So the only thing I can give is the date of the studies and maybe the first year of his practice at the Landgericht, so which is around between, as I said, 1901 to 1907. That's most certainly where most of these drawings have been drawn. And later on, Kafka, he didn't stop drawing, but what changed is probably less the style of the drawing than the context in the writing. If you like, I could jump. I'm sorry that I do jump now, so you can close your eye quickly if you like. So we see some of the drawings, but we can come back to all these elements. Oh, it's not so easy. It's not doing what I want. So, okay, here I wanted to get to. So this is the point when he, I would say, when we see the transition from drawing to writing. So this description is a little bit misleading because, I mean, he was doing both at the same time. To give a little bit more detailed picture, he was starting to write probably more or less at the same time, around 1901 too. So he already started to write, but first of all, most of that very early writing is lost, so we don't have it. And the earliest texts, which are called in German or in English, I can say description of a struggle, Beschreibung eines Kampfes, and the pieces that were published then in Betrachtung, which is, I think, what's the English title? Contemplation, or I don't know.
Meditation.
Meditation. I'm not sure what's the English title of the book. I mean, Kafka's first. So these are the very early pieces, small prose pieces that have been written in the years between 1904 and 1906-07. But for Kafka, this was absolutely not clear if he will become a writer at that time. He was at the same time probably more drawing than writing. I'd say around 98-9, this clearly changed. He somehow drew less and less, and he wrote more and more. I think an interesting case are the early diaries. When he started to write the diary, and I think for him, the decision to write the diary is connected to the decision to write in general. So, because this means you write regularly, you write more or less every day. And of course, the diaries are also a place where you are not only writing what you just did during the day, but also these are exercises to write, exercises in writing. But if you see here, in the early diaries, you see still quite some drawings. So he was here mixing writing and drawing, and not seldom, or even in most of these cases, the drawing tried to depict something that the writing failed to describe. I don't go into the details here, but this is interesting that the drawing still was very strong as an aesthetical way to express himself, even stronger than the writing at that point. So
I just want to point out a peculiar phenomenon that the letters, Kafka's letters are Kafka's letters, and they have a kind of wobble to them. And it's almost as though the letters just go right down into the faces on the right-hand page here, as though the lines of the faces and the lines of some of the capital letters were the same.
Yeah, that's true. There's some kind of a transformation of the writing and the drawing from one to each other. That's absolutely the case. And I think there is even a background for that. This, let's say, proximity of the writing and the drawing. First of all, it is clear that Kafka didn't go to an art shop and buy a canvas and a brush or brushes and colors and going to an atelier and painting. He was sitting at the same desk where he was writing. So he was the same Franz Kafka, and he was drawing and writing with the same pencil or pen or whatever. So he's using the same instrument, the same paper. So he is, so already from that point, from this material point, from the point of view of the creation of art and of writing, it's the same process. It's not a different process, it's one process. And on a more advanced level, I think these drawings are consisting, and I would agree to what you say, like the writing, just of a few lines. They are not, let's say, what could be the case. In some cases, it is like the example we just saw, exuberance of richness. I mean, that's already quite far away from writing, but it's still in the sense close that Kafka expresses in his drawings what he wants to show in just a few lines. And that's what you see here. And I would say the line is actually what connects writing and drawing. So both arts are consisting in lines.
One amazing benefit of this book is your essay. You write a really important historical essay describing how these drawings did and didn't come to light before you finally put them together. But you also write an analysis of Kafka's drawing and writing, in which you go through some of his relationship to visual art, which I'd like to talk about a bit, if you don't mind, but also the relationship between drawing and writing for him, and a really illuminating phrase, but maybe you could describe it, what it means a little bit for us, comes at the end of the text. You claim there's a negative dialectic of writing and drawing. Mm-hmm. Say what you mean by that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the example we see here is already an expression of this somehow negative dialectics. And if I say negative, I mean writing and drawing are by no means harmoniously illuminating each other, in the sense, for example, that drawing is an illustration of what he's writing, or vice versa, the writing is description what he is drawing. So this would be somehow like a positive reinforcements of the two arts. But for Kafka, there was, I would say, always in different ways, there were tensions between both of these arts. So very rarely he is really showing something that he is writing. Mostly he is showing something, if he is connecting it to the writing, like in these two cases we see here, he is describing, he's showing and drawing something that he cannot describe. And where the writing is failing, then he uses the drawing. And this already makes clear that the drawing is able of something that the writing is maybe not able to, of displaying, of making something visible, of expressing something that you cannot describe. And in these cases, I would say the rather few cases, when Kafka was drawing in connection to something that he was describing on the writing, it's mostly in that way that he is doing something by drawing that he cannot do by writing. Mm-hmm. And even stronger is this negative dialectics when it comes to the question of the illustration of his texts, which of course was never done by himself. So he never illustrated one of his texts. There were many writers at the times who did that. For example, Else Lasker Schüler is a strong example of a writer who was illustrating her books full of these colorful Oriental drawings, and Kafka never did that. So he never moved to somehow illuminating the writing by drawings, but others did. And Kafka was very, very hesitant about that, even to an extent where it was clear that he was rejecting it. And I would say, why was he rejecting the illustration of his text with art? Just because he knew about the power of the image, because it was clear to him that the image is in a way much more persuasive than the writing, because it pops into your eyes. It's urging you much more than the writing that you have painfully and with a lot of labor you have to work on that and to read and to try to understand. While the drawing and the image, you can immediately see what's there.
That really illuminates a lot for me, that the drawings are never illustrations when they're related a little bit later on to the writing. Mm-hmm. And that they have a relationship to the writing that's discrepant. They don't carry on the same idea or gesture. But also you're saying that there's something in the drawing that might help us understand the writing, and mm-hmm. that your essay really makes very perspicacious. And it illuminates this problem for me that everyone is always looking for what we could call sense in Kafka's writing. But if the drawings give you anything, they show you that what he's driving for, when he breaks down and realizes that only in drawing, for example, can he express something, is that there really isn't sense. There's only, let's say, the depiction of figures in a scene. And you can't really look for meaning in these sketches, not in that way. You see gesture, you see bodies extended in a certain way, you see the differences in heights and maybe attitudes towards something, but they're not semantic. And you could say that he struggled in his writing to produce a non-semantic writing. This is something that you're calling a Schriftbild, writing as image. And I think that's right. If you read a Kafka story, everyone's like, well, why does he turn into a bug in the Metamorphosis? What does this mean? And you can do a theological interpretation, a psychoanalytic interpretation. You can look for the meaning. But just allowing in writing to be a sketch of a particular figure is very difficult after thousands of years of trying to make meaning with writing. So I see how the sketches could be actually the heart of his work. And you know, at a point like this, he's disappointed that the writing can't just simply give you the attitudes of bodies in a room. Mm-hmm. Talking about illustrations of his stories, I wonder if you want to go through that question and maybe also talk a little bit about the circles that he moved in and what role images played there and where art was vis-a-vis literature in Prague. Prague was a kind of hotbed of poetry and fiction writing, also of little magazines that Kafka read and his friends published in and he published in, and there was a visual component to those magazines as well. So maybe we open up now to a kind of a broader context.
Yeah, I think I could start with getting back to the question of the illustration of his books and how we reacted to that. Even though this is historically a little bit later, but if you briefly go back, so this is his first book, Betrachtung, which is extremely, let's say, strong displaying the writing. So it's all about the writing. There's no drawing here at first sight. You don't see a drawing. It's very how would you translate schlicht? It's very the book is
spare or bare.
Bare, exactly, bare, spare. So there are no ornaments or nothing what you could understand at first sight as ornaments. But if you see his letter here to the publisher Ernst Rowohlt in 1912, he is asking for the largest types possible. I mean, writing, he means actually the types, the largest letters possible. And if you see here, this is the first edition. These letters are huge. They are much too large for any kind of normal writing. So they are by no way filling a normal page. So the book Betrachtung it's not a small format. It's quite a large book. And you see how huge these letters were, and Kafka wanted that. And so I think this comes to the point where he had this quite visual understanding of the writing. Writing was it's at the same time, these pages, they are somehow like the effect is extremely visual. So if you just go to through the book and read then these texts, you read the writing, you see the writing in its physical form, in its corporeality. The letters are on the white of the paper, they are here. And it's very remarkable that Kafka had this completely visual understanding of the writing. And I'm sure this comes from his, let's say, his attentiveness toward the image and the writing as image.
And we should mention just briefly before we move on that all of the very small pieces like this one in this book are images.
Exactly.
There's almost nothing beyond the image. Here he is, you could say, sketching out the trunks of trees in snow and how you can and can't see where they come from emerging out of the snow. And you can't see the ground. And he's moving back and forth between wanting to pin the image to a very clear outlines, but also being suspicious that the trees are only apparently connected to the ground. We don't have a translation of this one, but they're so imagistic.
Absolutely, on two levels. And you're correct. Not only the writing as I mean, the corporeality of the letters are images, but it's as we see the writing without starting even to read. But when you read the text, I would say it's like a painting. It's like, and to me, actually, a very much black and white, more like a drawing than a painting. There's no colors here. I mean, the trees in the snow, the trunks lying in the snow, and the question, are they connected to the ground or not? This is, I mean, it's like the letters on the paper. It's more or less an image for the writing that he is giving, but you're right, it's an image.
So the drawing and the writing here are really intertwined in every possible way, in the layout of the page, his attention to that, in the contents of the writing, which is more like a sketch. Did Kafka paint, or what was his relationship to painting or other art in Prague or in his orbit?
Yeah, I mean, to start to answer the question, I could go to the second and third example of illustration of his own text. So he himself never painted. So he was, let's say, call it only drawing. I mean, he was really drawing. So it looks all like what he has done. It's all like fragments or attempts or sketches. They are not completed drawings that you would hang on the wall and have no large size. So it's all rather small size and rather like exercises or something like that, fragments. And you see here the contrast to let's say to something which can be called, I mean, it's a print. It's not a painting in oil on canvas, but it's a print, but it's in color, the original. And I mean, the situation that Kafka was in here was really strange. When he wrote his second book, which is The Stoker, the Heizer, in 1913, we have to imagine he gets the package to his home delivered, excited. He opens up the package, looking forward to the books, and then he takes one out, opens it up, and on the left side you see what he sees. He sees the title and with subtitle a fragment, and on the left hand he sees this this picture with the subtitle in the harbor of New York, and he is to say it's only, let's say the least, he was shocked. He was immediately taking the pen and writing his publisher and saying that, what happened here? What's that? And this, this image is much too strong for my writing and even too beautiful for my writing. And so he wasn't even aware that his book will be illustrated. The publisher didn't say that to him. He didn't inform him about that. He just did it because in that time, which is the time of Expressionism, it was kind of it belonged to the books. It was like a tendency to illustrate the books. Also on the background that the arts are belonging together, but books are getting more, let's say, closer to art books and so on. And he was alerted, and that's why when his next book, which was actually The Metamorphosis, Die Verwandlung, when that came out, he wrote another letter to his publisher, giving him very clear instructions what he is not allowed to do. And what he says here, don't show the insect. So the insect itself cannot be depicted. It can not even be shown from a distance. And he's really very strongly making that point. And why is this so interesting? Again, he was so much aware of the power of the image as an illustration. And that's what he so much rejected. He didn't want, let's say, the fantasy of the reader be reduced by an image, or let's say, of an insect. And that's why he was warning the publisher of doing that and say, please don't do that. So I think
to speculate for a minute, just a speculative moment. What's wrong with illustration?
Yeah, I think in Kafka's view, and that's, I mean, what he also explicitly says is that precisely he knew about the power of the image, and that an image that is next to a writing in the sense of an illustration, showing what is written and displaying what is written, is to quite an extent maybe even disturbing or even destroying what has been written, just because it makes everything so clear and so, let's say, probably even one-dimensional. And that's what he wanted to avoid any kind of let's say, illustration in that sense of making it explicit. And maybe what you said before, a type of illustration, or illustration is a type of image that gives sense, that is maybe one-dimensional, that says, okay, here I show it to you, and this would be wrong. That will be the problem.
Having taught the Metamorphosis for many years, one thing that comes to mind right now because of this discussion is, in fact, what's so exciting to students and to me is that you can't picture the bug, the vermin. It's really hard to figure out where the limbs are. Part of that is because it's described from the perspective of the person who has just become the bug. So in fact, to see it from the outside, the aim is to see it from the vermin's perspective, which would be maybe impossible to depict. But people are thinking, how is this possible? Where are its legs? What does this mean to turn over on its belly? That seems to be the real fascination of the story, to not be able to fully visualize.
Right. Exactly. So, I mean, anyhow, the transformation, the metamorphosis to the insect is by no means something which is reduced to something like let's say, a real insect, or something which is real. It's much more on a, let's say, on a symbolic or on a transformative level what happens there. And I think that was precisely the anxiety of Kafka, that the image would destroy that. I mean, the illustration. And that is why he actually, what he did in this letter also is that he made a suggestion how to illustrate, if it has to be done. So, and that's actually the lower part of this letter. You can read it if you like. He gives a suggestion what he could do. And what he says here is the parents and the sister in the lightened room with the door open up the adjoining room that lies in the darkness. And it's quite interesting that he illustrated it in the end precisely what Kafka wanted. So Ottomar Starke, that was actually the artist who did the cover, So he followed 100% Kafka's suggestion. And in that sense, Kafka indeed did illustrate his own book. He gave the, let's say, how to say that, the recipe, what could be done. If it had to be done, if it really needed to be done, then only in that way. So you can't see it, but you can somehow, you have an idea that there is something in the dark behind this door.
One thing you know about Kafka, if you read enough of the letters, is that behind politeness and deference and other things is an iron control of situations.
Absolutely.
So what was Kafka looking at that gave him some of the impulses to draw in the way that he did? What did he like if it wasn't illustration?
Maybe this leads back to your former question that, asking what was the context of Kafka's understanding of art. And I think that's also something that we didn't know so far, because also here the sources haven't been really known. Allow me to jump to an earlier phase of this presentation. And it is really interesting that, as I already said, Kafka did, sorry, this is a bit slower. I cannot control it so good. Okay, I start here. So we have to imagine that, as I already said, in 1901, he started his studies of law. Then in the second semester, he was already done with law. I said, no, I don't really like it. It's too dry. And then he studied literature, art history, and philosophy. And not only that, it gets very, if you look closer, we see that at that time he was really going into the study of art, meaning that he was reading the respective journals, like the Kunstwart, which was at the time the most important journal for art and also literature. And the main, let's say, person of influence for him was his school friend, Oskar Pollack, at that time. He didn't know Max Brod yet. And Oskar Pollack, who actually turned to get an art historian himself, he was, played quite a large role on Kafka's growing attentiveness towards art. And we see that also that he was buying art pieces, here reproductions, and these two, they hang in Kafka's writing room, in his room. The Plugman by Hans Thoma and the Dancing Menat, a relief, an antique relief, a reproduction that he also had. So he collected some pieces of art reproductions, and we see later also originals. And he got the correspondent of art in the reading and speech hall of the German students at the university in Prague. So, which means he was really into art at that time, which means very concrete, he organized events, he was buying books or reading books related to art. You see, it's on the very low level, Kunstberichterstatter Jur Kafka. So this is from these procedures of the reading and speech hall of the German students.
Which was a student club, more or less a student union.
Exactly. So Kafka was very active in this student reunion. And I would even go so far to say that for him, and also for his fellow students like Max Brod himself and Oskar Pollack, it was much more important. They were much more enthusiastic about the activities in the student club than the study program in the law itself. Because the law, I mean, you do it, it's like a duty, you have to do it. But it's not the place where your heart is beating. The heart is beating in literature and art. So that's why all these students, they were extremely active in this student club. And what they did, for example, and this I think is another interesting turn, is they were electrified when a Prague artist named Emil Orlik was exhibiting in 1902 a huge exhibition in Prague. And he was, Emil Orlik was at that time very highly respected, and he was just getting back from Japan. He went to Japan in order to learn the Japanese wood print, the art of wood printing. And on the left side, you see a print which is not by a Japanese artist, but much more by Emil Orlik, who was a Bohemian Prague artist. But you see, he was also reflecting on the way the wood printing is, let's say, changing the aesthetics that we are around 1900 aware of. If you just go back to the Kunstwart that we just saw, it's very much 19th century art. It's very, let's say, even bourgeois, Biedermeier, what we see, Hans Thoma, it's very German. You see the peasants and the ploughman and the dirt and so on, and the ground, the trees. But here, the Japanese art is that all these students were totally electrified by this Japanese art, including Kafka. It was much more abstract. It was a totally different aesthetics. And you see here the drawer, his art is concentrated in the line. It's just one line. And Orlik is wonderfully bringing that to the image that, I mean, this is the artist. He's drawing a line on the white paper. That's it. It's very slim. It's very even abstract. It's close to abstraction. And I think this was very important for Kafka. Kafka was totally electrified by this Japanese art. And you see here a postcard that he was sending to Max Brod. And he is writing on the postcard, "My dearest Max, I kiss you here on a dirty but my most beautiful postcard." And it's a print by Hiroshige. So it's very clear that for Kafka, the Japanese art was somehow a change, a total change in the aesthetics that leads much more to his type of drawing than the Kunstwart aesthetics, which is totally far away from what Kafka did. So only to give two contexts of his of art for him. Yeah.
I realize there's much more in the book, including his relationship to Prague Expressionism and artists who were friends of his, like Alfred Kubin, from whom you could learn a lot about Kafka, I think, especially the subjects. He was kind of the Prague Goya almost. Maybe we should stop here, since we've come on a big arc from the discovery of these works of art to their context and their function in Kafka's intellectual and literary world, and open the floor to some questions. I want to also point out that in addition to the drawings being reproduced here in beautiful facsimiles, that there are essays. There's also, it's basically a catalogue raisonné of all of these works. So all of the details of the works are there. And there's an essay by the critical theorist Judith Butler on the metaphysics of these drawings, the way bodies are looking for ground to stand on, but don't find them. A really full volume where you can get much more context than we could give here. In the meantime, if it's okay with you, Andreas, we'll ask the audience if there's questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Andreas. And thank you, Paul. Most fascinating conversation. If people have questions, which I'm sure there are many, but if you're able to verbalize them, feel free to either turn on raise your hand on the Zoom function, and we can call on you directly, or you can use the chat box on the bottom of your screen to write any questions that you may have. And so we do have, both Paul and Andreas have agreed to stay a little bit longer for any questions that people may have. So, and obviously this is all very new and unknown to most people, I'm sure. So it may take a while for people to process what they've been hearing and seeing. But yeah, feel free to ask any questions. In the meantime, I'll get us started. Andreas, is there a sense at all of why the two friends that you mentioned decided not to bring these drawings to light any earlier? Why was it so important to them to keep it a secret?
That's a complicated and a very good question. I try to be as short as possible. It is, on the one hand, clear that Max Brod, he showed a few of these drawings after Kafka's death, starting actually in the year 1937, when writing the biography, the first biography on Franz Kafka. So in the end, he added a few of these drawings, which actually we do know now. I think some of you already knew a few of these drawings. They have been put on the covers of the pocketbooks of Kafka, so I think they are known. They got known, but these are actually only very few. But the large part of these drawings he kept away, locked them away, and never, let's say, never even really tried to edit them. Even though, and this is probably the more concrete part of my answer, he had opportunities. From the 50s on, there have been several publishers who turned to him and said, okay, you have shown a few examples of these drawings, why don't we publish them all? Actually, the truth is, Max Brod in that time didn't want to do that. And the reasons for that are quite complex. On the one hand, they didn't belong to him anymore because he donated all this material to his secretary. And secondly, on the other hand, he was at that time, which is in the 50s and 60s, Brod was already quite aged. He has been criticized quite strongly about his way to edit and to interpret Kafka, especially also his way to edit his texts. And he was very anxious that he could be criticized strongly of how to edit these drawings. So he felt very insecure about that, and he really didn't want to do that. So he rejected the possibilities that he had.
That's so fascinating, just to think about how different kind of what we would think of as very like worldly factors can impact these things.
If there's no questions right away in the gallery, maybe I could ask you something about your other work. One thing I know about you, aside from being a world expert on Kafka, which there are not that many, is that you're attracted to the Kafkas that nobody knows. There's a bunch of things we didn't know about Kafka. I didn't know when I was a graduate student, and you were kind enough to have lunch with me or something, that he was into seances. Mm-hmm. Could you talk a little bit about some of the other things he was into that we don't know, including his spiritualism?
The unknown Kafka. I think one aspect we didn't talk about, but what could be, say an aspect of the unknown Kafka still coming from the drawing, that is his sense of humor. I think the drawing, probably even more than the writings, they make clear that Kafka was very much inclined to the humoresque, to the carnivalesque, to the grotesque. So there's a lot of smiling in these drawings. I mean, I think the examples we have seen, I think they already show that. I could give you many more other, or you find it in the book, other examples of this very strong humorous element in Kafka that in the writing, in his stories and his novels, it's not absent, but you have to really look for it. It's not obvious, but I think in a drawing it's much more obvious. You see it. It's part of a Kafka that I think didn't really know that it's funny is probably the wrong word, but it's also, of course, a type of humor where you do not really laugh. You can also probably be even shocked. And it's more like the grotesque and the carnivalesque. So in the sense of Kubin or Bachtin or this type of comic that you find in these drawings. And if you then go back to the writing, I think you see even better that this is also part of the writing. So I just to give one example of this probably maybe neglected part of Kafka.
Thank you. It's really terrific. It's such a better option than the tragic or existentialist Kafka. So much truer and brings you much closer to, I think, what's really going on in stories, even like in the penal colony, in the Strafkolonie, which is horrific tale of torture and is also paradoxically and somewhat shamefully, utterly shamefully funny. I think if there's no further questions, we can thank you, Andreas, for this enormous job of work, for a revelation that only comes about once every century, really, for a world artist like Kafka. I hope that there's a lot of readers and this gets a lot of airplay.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you, Andres. Congratulations on the book and just for even the tenacity to track all this down and to stick with it and to make it happen. And thank you for contributing to worldwide knowledge, really, of something that nobody else really knew about. So most fascinating. And thank you, Paul, for hosting and for being a great discussant and even knowing the right questions to ask is very important. Thank you, everybody. Thank you again, Paul. Thank you, Andreas. Thank you, Yale University Press, for a fantastic talk.